In Washington, you've gotten word, I'm sure by now, of course, the talks have been going on having to do with gun safety and the framework that was put together by Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, a framework for potential history in getting some gun legislation passed. Well, the actual text of that is now out, and they're hoping possibly that Congress is going to take that up before they start their 2-week recess this Friday. I want to bring in New York Congressman Ritchie Torres, a friend of our show here. I think I can call you now. Congressman Torres, it's always good to have you here on the program. And look, we've been watching certainly what's going on with gun safety we're going to get into, but these hearings as well with the January 6th committee. I'm going to start there with a quick question because our ABC Ipsos poll showed that only 9% of Americans say that they are watching this very closely. So for those who are not or have not been watching very closely, just from what we saw yesterday, you pluck out the headline. And what is the thing you want to make sure Americans do know from yesterday's hearings that came out if they aren't watching so closely?
Look, a few months ago, a federal judge found that former President Donald Trump in all likelihood committed federal crimes, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding and conspiracy to defraud the United States. The January 6th committee has made a powerful case that Donald Trump knew that he lost the election, and despite knowing that he lost the election, he persisted in lying to the American people. He raised hundreds of millions of dollars from those lies. He pressured his own vice president, members of Congress, and state and federal officials to overturn the results of the election. And he inspired a violent assault on the U.S. Capitol. And as the assault was unfolding, he did nothing to stop the violence. He stood by passively, refusing to order either the National Guard or federal law enforcement to intervene. He stood by passively, even as a violent mob threatened to murder his own vice president.
Well, Congressman, a part of what's come out in these hearings as well is that potentially some members of Congress actually lobbied the White House for pardons for themselves, having to do with their part of the insurrection. Now, you have now want to introduce legislation that would require members of Congress to disclose any pardon requests that they did make retroactive to before the insurrection. Why is that important? And can you tell me first, how many members of Congress potentially do you know of or think did request a pardon for their part in January 6th?
Well, the January 6th Commission only revealed that Representative Scott Perry sought a pardon for himself in the wake of January 6th, but we know he's the tip of the iceberg. And my view is seeking a pardon for yourself is a form of self-dealing. It's a conflict of interest that should be disclosed to the Ethics Committee and to the public. And so I introduced legislation that would require members of Congress seeking a pardon for themselves to disclose it to the Ethics Committee, because the public has a right to know who is pursuing pardons for themselves. You know, the Republicans claim to have done nothing wrong with respect to January 6th. But if you've done nothing wrong, why would you seek a pardon? The very act of seeking a pardon is an implicit acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and that should be known to the public.
Congressman, I don't know if you've had a chance to read through the text now of the gun legislation, that framework that we heard about with Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. They do have now in a text legislation. So the text of it. How do you think that, and again, that was drafted in response to what we saw in Uvalde, but there is day-to-day violence in this country that takes place, and certainly the area you represent here in New York, it is one of the poorest districts in the country. It is one of the districts with the highest number of people of color, but it's also the borough here in New York, according to the mayor's office, accounted for in the past decade roughly a third of the shooting incidents in New York took place in your district. Was this legislation going to do anything about that type of violence? And what does it take for us? Does it have to be a tragedy where babies are killed in Texas before we take up gun legislation to address the violence that your community is dealing with day in and day out?
Look, in a rational world, we would pass legislation that bans high-capacity magazines and assault rifles, the AR-15, and that mandates universal background checks, but none of those proposals could survive a filibuster in the Senate. You know, the bipartisan compromise is the best hope for moving the ball forward on gun safety.
In the Bronx just a few weeks ago, an 11-year-old was killed by a stray bullet. And that didn't necessarily make huge national headlines, but that type of violence that communities are dealing with Does this legislation do anything to address that type of thing that so many communities across the country are dealing with?
I think the legislation is going to be effective at preventing mass shootings, but it falls short. The majority of guns recovered in the Bronx and New York City is coming from the South, is flowing through the iron pipeline. And so we have to crack down on the iron pipeline. New York State and New York City have the strictest gun laws in the country. But state and local laws could only take you so far if guns can freely move across state boundaries. So we need the federal government to do more.
You know what? That's a great point to make. Some of the strictest gun laws, but still we see some of the worst violence and gun violence. And certainly, and I know you wish it the same, but Congressman, hopefully some will be found to do something about some of those shootings and that violence affecting so many communities, in particular of color in this country. Congressman Torres, it's always good to have you here on the program. We will see you down the road, all right?
Take care.
Well, hey there, GMA fans. Robin Roberts here. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Lots of great stuff here. So go on, click the subscribe button right over here to get more of awesome videos and content from GMA every day, anytime. We thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the morning on GMA.